Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. In this video, I just want to go through a really interesting paper I've just read by Jamie Turner. It's just been published recently, and it's an article with the title Ibn Taymiyya on Theistic Science and Knowledge of God. So what I want to do is just go through this paper with you, just talk about some things that I found interesting, and then recommend that those of you who can access it, read the paper. So the title of the paper, like I said, is Ibn Taymiyya on Theistic Science and Knowledge of God. So the paper has been published, I believe, in April, and the abstract draws on what's called the Qur'anic Rationalism of someone that's very famous in the Islamic tradition, at least, or in the Islamic intellectual tradition, which is Taqī Ibn Taymiyya. And it talks about Islamic epistemology of theistic natural science, right? And what he looks at is God's method of proof through science. Istidlāluhu, taʿālā bil-āyāt. So God's proof, or proof of God through science. And of course, as you know, broadly speaking, there are signs in the Quran, the verses in the Quran, which are called the āyāt of the Quran, but there are also signs in the world, right? So there are, broadly speaking, two types of signs that we find when we deal with the Quran, or we deal with epistemology in Islam, or truth in Islam as well. And what he also wants to do is engage with certain contemporary philosophers of religion. He mentioned someone called Stephen Evans, which he'll talk about in the paper as well. So at the beginning, in the Quran, we know that the term ayah or ayat has two meanings, like I mentioned. The first is the signs of God, which are manifest in the Quran, in the divine speech and revelation itself. So when we read the Quran, we have the verses there, we have the ayat, the signs there in the Quran itself. And then we also have what are the second types of signs, if you like, which are the signs in the natural world, right? And this is what Ibn Taymiyya talks about. So there are two types of signs, right? There's two ways of knowing God. One is through the text itself, if you like, and the other one is through the natural world, looking out the natural world and then realizing, coming to know that there is a God, there is a creator, and so forth as well. And so they point to the reality and the unity of the divine, the existence of God, if you like, as well. So those are that's just the basic outline of what an ayah or a sign is when we talk about them, especially when Ibn Taymiyya talks about them. Now what he's going to do is going to talk about two of them, but in particular he's going to focus on the second one, which is the natural world, looking at the world around us, the cosmos, to come to realize that there is actually a God, and there is divine, there is a divine existence, there is an existence out there as well. So in his most, I mean, he deals with, in the beginning of the article, he brings in Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Rushd basically talks about how you can find two arguments for God's existence. He quotes one of his books, written by Ibn Rushd, which is called Al-Kashf al-Manahij al-Adilla fi Aqa'id al-Millah. And in there, Ibn Rushd talks about the first type of signs of God, which is in the Quran. And there are two arguments, and he presents them in the article as well. However, what our author wants to do, he wants to focus on Ibn Taymiyya. Ibn Taymiyya is a very, very famous 14th century Damascene Islamic theologian, and he says there's an alternative way of seeing these ayat, right, which are both the verses in the Quran and in the natural world, right? And they can function, the verses in the Quran and the natural world, as signs. They can function as evidence for God, theistic evidence, right? And so he says, Ibn Taymiyya would say that the broader signs in the natural world are also proof of God as well, the existence of God as well. So just going beyond the Quran as well. And so Ibn Taymiyya takes that position in this particular article as well, which Jamie is looking at as well. So that when we look at these ayat, inference through science, istidlāl bil āyāt, we have this idea that if you have a distinctive, it's a distinctive Fitra-based epistemology. What does that mean? Basically, if your Fitra, and I'll talk about what Fitra is in Islamic concept, or at least what how Ibn Taymiyya understands it, is if your Fitra, your natural disposition, if you like, is Salim, if it's correct, it's not corrupt, then if you look at the natural world around you, you should, by reflecting upon them, just come to the conclusion that God does exist, right? So let's go into that a little bit. So Ibn Taymiyya's epistemology is truth, how we understand things, right? And he says there's three primary ways that we get knowledge. One of them is through sense perception, what's called the hiss, the senses. Number two is through reason, aql. And the third one is what's called khabar, which is report or testimony, right? And sense perception, just looking at things, touching things, hearing things, is the most basic, most fundamental way to understand things, right? But Ibn Taymiyya has an interesting take on all of this, and that's what's called Fitra. And that's a centerpiece of Ibn Taymiyya's epistemology, right? So if you want to understand how Ibn Taymiyya constructs this idea of knowing God, you need to know how at the center of his theory, at the center of his idea, is the concept of Fitra, right? And so according to him, what is a Fitra? Fitra is basically the original nature of a person, which is uncorrupted by later beliefs, later practices, upbringing, socialization, right? And so it's uncorrupted by anything. So a child is born uncorrupted, right? And they are ready to accept the true notions of Islam. That's how one would argue Ibn Taymiyya's understanding of Fitra is. So you have to understand what Fitra is. And the Fitra is obviously something that scholars of Islam, Muslims talk about time and time again, this natural, original nature of a person, right? And so it's one author calls it the original normative disposition. So we are all born with this disposition to accept not Islam, but the true notions of Islam, right? That, if you're not corrupted, right, you're unaffected by your family, the social environment, then you'll know these true notions of Islam, right? And so through the Fitra, through looking at the world, if your Fitra is uncorrupted and you look at the world around you, you should come to realize that there is a God and God does exist, right? And so this is really, really important, because if the Fitra, if you turn it around, if the Fitra is corrupted, right, this original normative disposition is corrupted, then this is when you have problems, okay? So for Ibn Taymiyya, the proper functioning of all our faculties, right, through which we know truth, is predicated on the health of our Fitra. And this is why in Islamic tradition, just on a slightly tangential point, this is why it's really important that children, when we have children, we give them tarbiyah, right? We bring them up properly and we give them a right environment, because once that becomes corrupted, they can't make sense of the world. But a person, if he lived in a desert, for example, and he didn't have contact with people or had lived a very basic lifestyle, one would expect him or her to eventually come to some notion of what Islam is actually about, i.e. belief in God, there's only one God, God exists, and so forth. But because of corruption, people are then, when they make sense of the world, because their Fitra is corrupted, there's a dissonance. And that's very, very important. So that's a centerpiece of Ibn Taymiyya's argument for the existence or knowledge of God, right? And so as long as if your cognitive faculties are working well and your Fitra is functioning properly, then you should come to know the signs of God, or to come to know God, knowledge of God, right? So what it basically means that these things are just natural, right? You don't need to reason them out. If you study theology or kalam, what you find is the scholars bring out lots of arguments, sophisticated arguments, to prove the existence of God or knowledge of God and so forth. But what Ibn Taymiyya is saying that no, you can do that. You don't even need to go to that next stage. You can, before that, what you can do is you don't need to do any sort of inference, right? So, you know, the affirmation of a creator and his perfection is fitriya, is innate, and daruriya, right? It's necessary, right? As long as your fitra remains intact and you're not corrupted by the world around you, then naturally, innately, you'll come to realize that there is a God and that he is perfect. And it's necessary for you to come to this conclusion without any reasoning, right? It's just, you just know it, right? And so this is something to really think about, and very, very interesting from Ibn Taymiyya's perspective here. I'll talk about later on about the second level, where, you know, you need to have Muslim theologians, the mutakallimun, who say that, you know, knowledge of God or is necessary, but is not necessary, right? That it's acquired, muktasab, i.e., to know God, you have to sort of do some reasoning, basic reasoning, or some sophisticated reasoning even, to come to know God as well. Ibn Taymiyyah says that's true. Sometimes you need to do that, but actually, before you do any of that, right? Before you do any of that, just if you're not corrupted and you just basically think to yourself, you come to the conclusion that God exists. You'll come to knowledge of God. So that's what Ibn Taymiyyah is saying first and foremost. That before you start, you know, using all these sophisticated levels of thinking and reasoning, you can actually come to know God without doing all of this, right? But that's only if your fitra, your natural disposition, is uncorrupted. And that's why socialization, the society that you live in, the people that you live with, it's very, very important, right? And this is why our scholars emphasize, you know, bringing up children in a very religious environment where they're allowed to explore and just think, and they're not corrupted from society, right? Because society has these effects upon people. But that's a separate conversation. That's why sociology is also important, although we're doing a bit of theology here as well. So Ibn Taymiyyah says you don't need to go into a lot of these long-winded philosophical methods. He's not saying you don't need to do them, but they said they're not necessary, right? And he says, look, just look at God's method of proof through science, istidlāluhu taʿālā bil āyāt, right? And he says this is just fitri knowledge. It's immediate, right? That's, if you look at them, you come to, they indicate, if you look around you in your natural state, that there is one creator, right? So it's natural, it's fitra, like you just know that you look around you and God exists as well, right? And he actually says as well that this is the way of the prophets, right? May Allah bless all of them, in proving the existence of God, right? That they would make mention of his signs, right? And there are plenty of these that are, of course, mentioned in the Quran as well. So for him, it's a natural inference, or istidlāl, right? That you just look at the signs of God in a natural world and you immediately grasp belief, right? You have belief immediately, right? So this is something to bear in mind as well. And what is this idea of knowledge of Allah or God by way of science? So the pristine way, the most pure way to reach knowledge of God is in reference to the many signs which indicate his existence and particular nature, right? So, you know, whether within yourself, you look within yourself, you look at how perfect you are as a creation, how it all works, you can come to knowledge of God that way. Or looking around you, the cosmos, āyātul āfāq, right? To look around you, right? And so this is such knowledge of God is just a natural product of sound cognition, right? It's if you reason well, your nature is pure, then you'll come to this conclusion, just like a child would, right? The child is uncorrupted by society. So one's heart, which is the head of all cognition, the heart and mind, you know, when it comes together, this is true, that there must be a God, without even going into, you know, philosophical arguments as well. So once we know this, right, once the fitra is unspoilt, then the heart and the mind will come to know God, and the heart and the person will love God and will then worship God, right? And so this is important. So the fitra is important, and it's known through sense perception as well. So the senses are also important. So our fitri disposition, the fitra, right, which allows us to form beliefs about God, and our sense perceptual faculties, our senses, when they're working, both of them are working as the way they should be working. They're not corrupted. They're working sound, in a sound manner, right? Then you can come to know God. You can come to know belief about God, right? By looking at nature, by looking around you. And this is called non-inferential, because what you're doing is you're not kind of like sitting down and coming out with all these logical arguments, but it just makes sense to you, right? So this is very, very important to bear in mind. So he's saying this is what Ibn Taymiyya is saying, that this comes by just looking at the cosmos, just looking within yourself, looking around you, and if your faculties and if your fitra, your natural disposition is uncorrupted, then you should come to the conclusion of God, right? That God exists, right? Now, of course, he's not completely negating reason. So he's not saying that, you shouldn't think about these things, right? And that you don't need to think about these things. Yes, you can come to know God through rational reflection as well, right? So there's also that way as well. But if you're going to go down that way, that's a rational fitri method, right? Al-turuq al-aqliya al-fitriya, which the Quran does actually. But at a primary level, you can just look around you and you'll come to know God exists. But if you think a little bit more at a secondary level, then you should also come to realize that God exists as well. And this is the way the Quran actually does it as well, right? So there's a second level as well. So in some ways, sense perception, whether that's external or internal, is involved in looking at the signs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need to use your reason, right? Reason can come at a secondary level, and a lot of scholars do this, and you can come to the conclusion that God indeed does exist as well. So far, just to quickly summarize what we're going through, which is this istidlāl bil āyāt, right? Inference through science. So our senses, they look around the world or within us, and we reason in some cases, right? So we have that, right? And then we have our fitra, which is uncorrupted, right? Which is sound. And so we make sense of the world. And because the cognitive functions are working properly, one will come to what's called theistic belief, right? That you'll see automatically, it'll trigger within you, in your heart, in your mind, that hasala fi qalbi, right? That you'll have proper belief. So the reason people struggle is that their fitra has been corrupted, and this is why the scholars focus a lot on purifying the soul, on the nafs, right? Because it's become corrupted, and so therefore it's not able to make sense of the world, right? There's a dissonance. So that's important to bear in mind. So one of the reasons we look around the world and we're like, none of this proves the existence of God. I'm looking at trees and I'm looking at the skies and the mountains. Why doesn't this make sense? Perhaps it's because our natural disposition has been corrupted, right? But if it's not corrupted and we use our senses properly, we should come to the conclusion that God does exist. So this is really, really important. And this is really basic for Ibn Taymiyya, without doing any reasoning at all, right? So I hope people have understood. And of course, if you're not quite clear, you can always reach out to me. And I hope that I've done justice to Jamie's paper here as well. In the paper, then Jamie quotes Wail Halaq, and he raises some objections to Ibn Taymiyya's argument, which I'm not going to go into, but it's there in the paper, and you can read that if you wanted to, because it's beyond what I want to discuss. And then what the author does is he brings in other authors who seem to be saying something similar to what Ibn Taymiyya is saying. And this goes back to this broader idea that, sometimes we do find that Muslims and non-Muslims, scholars from different parts of the world, different parts of history, seem to be saying similar things. They may not be saying the exact same thing, but they may be saying similar things. So what Jamie does here is he brings in someone called Stephen Evans, and he has a book, Natural Science and Knowledge of God, a new look at theistic arguments. And he basically says that there's a theistic natural sign which God has set up, right? That people can come to apprehend them, and then as a result come to have true beliefs about God, right? And he says that a theistic natural sign, for it to be a sign at all, there must be some sort of inbuilt propensity in us, which is what we would call a fitra, right? So when we come across the signs of God, right, and we need to make a judgment about it, right, this sign and this inbuilt propensity triggers something, right? So there must be something in us, a natural capacity or inclination within God's creatures, between me and you, that we recognize God's signs. Like He's put something inside us that when we connect with His creation, when we see His creation within us and around the world, in the cosmos, in space, or wherever, that should trigger something within us, right? So he calls this idea the Pascalian Constraints on knowledge of God. That the first one is what's called a wide accessibility principle. Basically, all it means is that that God, it's conceivable, if God wants us to know Him, that He would make knowledge of His existence widely available, right? And He wouldn't make it difficult for us, right? You know, if He wants everybody to go to paradise and everybody to try and strive to make Him happy and seek His pleasure, then He would make, it's conceivable that God would make His sign conceivable to everybody, right? That's the first thing. So that's what Evans talks about. And the second thing is that, you know, this idea of so wide accessibility principle. And the second thing is what's called the easy resistibility principle, right? That through knowledge, though knowledge of God is widely available, so there's two theories, it's not forced on humans. So it's accessible to everybody, but nobody's forced to accept it, right? So it's widely available, but nobody's forced to, right, accept it as well. And so anybody who does not want to enter into a special relation with God can find it easy to reject Him if they wanted to, right? And so this kind of like, he's basically arguing that this concept of theistic natural science of Evans is in some way similar to Ibn Taymiyya's conception of istidlāl bil āyāt as well. And then he talks about this a little bit more in the article. What's interesting here for our purposes is that Ibn Taymiyya mentions that when the Fitra, we mentioned before, is unimpaired, then you can acquire knowledge of God, right? But when your Fitra is corrupted, you're going to have problems. And what are these impediments? What are things that are going to get in the way of your Fitra? One of them is certain desires, hawa, right? Gharad, right? Personal motives, which then obstruct your way of knowing the truth, right? Those are two of them. Other people also say that ignorance and heedlessness are also detrimental, right? Because these things will corrupt your Fitra. So if you're following your desires, you have personal motives, you're not interested in the truth, right? You have arrogance, Ibn Taymiyya says, you have your purposes are corrupt, and you don't have love for God, right? Then you're going to find it difficult, despite the fact that God has made it accessible to come to know Him. But what happens is you've made the choice that you're not going to accept God, right? And so you resist the signs of God, right? Because their underlying nature or their Fitra is impaired, at least in the Taymiyyan perspective, right? So that's something that I wanted to say as well. And so, however, it's worth saying that even though Ibn Taymiyya says that, you know, you can see the signs of God without even having to reason too much, to go through inference, you know, and if your Fitra is uncorrupted, you'll come to realize God. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need arguments, right? That, you know, you can use what's called propositional evidence, right? That you look at nature and you make arguments like the cosmological, teleological, moral arguments, right? And say, well, this is data. This is telling us that God is the best or only explanation, right? So although you can get knowledge of God through Fitra, right, in an immediate way, you can also come to know God by way of argument, right? And he says, Ibn Taymiyya says, yes, when people are corrupted, their nature is corrupted, then this is the method that you'll need to use, right? That although it's fitri daruri fi nufus al-anfas, it's there within you, sometimes you need another. Sometimes you need to sit down with people and you need to explain to them that actually there are arguments that God exists as well. And this is usually used when people's nature is corrupted. So when people are pure people, innocent people, you know, they're not corrupted by society, then they'll come to know that God exists. And you'll find people like this, just people living in the countryside, not corrupted by society, and come to know God. But you'll have other people, because of corruption, the fitra, the natural disposition is corrupted, so then they'll find problems as well. So he says, yeah, you can do this as well, right? So this is something to bear in mind as well. So although rational speculation is not necessary in theory to prove God's existence, it is possible, and in fact it might be necessary for people whose fitra has been corrupted, and so they would not know God without the inference, right? So they need to know, like, people need to sit down with them and reason with them, and so you can use that as a secondary level to come to know God as well, right? So this is a flexibility in Ibn Taymiyya's model, right? So you have basic dharuri, which is like just basic coming to know God, and then you have what's called muktasab, which is like you acquire, you have to think a little bit, you have to reason a little bit, and then you come to conclusion that there is a God. But there's two levels, right? And one is the primary level where it's just fitra, it's just natural. Fitratullahi allati fatara an-nas alayha. This is just the fitra. And then you have people who you just need to sit down with, and because of their fitra is corrupted, they need to basically realign that. And that's really, really important, really, really helpful when you're dealing with people as well. And so this is something that Ibn Taymiyya talks about as well. And he also talks about how the fitra can sometimes be corrupted, and you can read that in the paper as well. According to Ibn Taymiyya, then, as a summary, there are two broad categories of signs, right? One is the signs which indicate existence of Allah, and i.e. the signs that are mentioned in the Quran, the verses of the Quran, the āyāt of the Quran. But there are also other signs, which is what we've been talking about, which is his creative acting, which he created in the souls and within us and in the cosmos, right? So there are two broad arguments, two broad ayat that we can talk about. We're talking about the secondary one, which is the one that looks at the creative acting, in which he created in the souls and the cosmos as well. So this divine design discourse, right? It awakens the fitra. So when people read the Quran and they look at the world, right, it alerts them, right? Actually, this is natural. This is what human beings are meant to be doing, and recognizing that there is a God, right? So the prophets basically came to perfect their fitra. People moved away from the Hanif way, the way of Abraham, right? This idea of worshiping the one God, and for various reasons, they moved away from the fitra. And the prophets, what they do is they bring people back to that natural disposition, right? Recognition, worship, and love of God. Okay, and it's also very experiential, right? That it's not just a theistic affirmation of belief, but it urges me and you to stand in awe of the signs of God and in praise of God. So it's very experiential. It's very real for people to experience as well. So this is important as well. And this is like really useful for ordinary people, because you don't really need to get into complex arguments, right? You can just, but obviously that's on the condition that their fitra is sound. This is something that Ibn Taymiyya emphasizes time and time again, and the author does as well, that as long as people's fitra is uncorrupted, then they'll come to know the truth. But we live in a society, as you know, in many parts of the world, where everything is refashioning, remolding, destroying, whatever it's doing to the fitra. And so a lot of times the problems we have is that our natural disposition has become corrupted. So when we see God's creation, when we see the beauty of what's within us and what's around us, we're not able to make that connection, right? So this is something to bear in mind. So in contrast to philosophers like Ibn Rushd and the Mutakallimin, what Ibn Taymiyya basically does is he presents a very unique alternative to construing how knowledge of God may be attained in the absence of argumentation, which is through apprehension of just natural signs, right, of God, as long as the fitra is uncorrupted. I'm going to stop there. I think I've talked for quite a bit. If people have questions, I really do recommend people read the article. It is quite academic, but I've tried to go through some of the main points because I find it very, very interesting, at a very basic level anyway. I hope you found that useful. Stay safe, and inshallah, I'll see you all very, very soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.